What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. Make sure you are following and subscribing to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com. I got a great guest coming on today. I have John Yu. He is back. Everyone loves him. He's probably someone that provides the most insightful analysis, especially when it comes to some of the issues that we're facing today. John, welcome back to the program. How are you?
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me back.
Well, I'm always glad to have you back because there's a really couple important cases. But one of the cases that interests me most is the case Texas and the United States about everything that's going on with immigration. And now that Texas is claiming that this is an invasion, I wanted to bring you on because I really want to try and get an understanding. Have we ever defined what constitutes an invasion? Because I think that's going to be an important question for the court.
This is a really hard question. There is a provision in the Constitution that has never been to the Supreme Court before, and that's this what we call the invasion clause. And so generally, the Constitution
And
says,
just so people are aware, it's Article 4, Section 4.
yes, well, there's two. There's that one, and then there's another one, which I think is even more important, which is in Article 1, Section 10,
Correct.
which actually I think is the one that gives the best hope for Texas. I think the one in Article 4 that you mentioned is the best hope for the Biden administration. So,
Well,
so the
can
way,
you explain that? Because I
yeah,
find that
yeah,
really interesting.
yeah. So basically, the Constitution prohibits states from having standing military, from going to war. It says you can't go to engage in war unless Congress gives you permission. So if you're the Biden administration, that's what you'd say. You say you can't use the military at the border. A state can't have a military use it at the border unless Congress gives you permission. But then there's this clause that says unless actually invaded or there's some kind of emergency circumstances which require the state to act without delay. And so that's what Texas is saying. Texas is saying, look, we've got millions of people coming across the border every year. They're uh, causing drugs trafficking. They're causing human trafficking. There's organized crime. There might be terrorists in the flow of migrants across the border. We think this is an invasion. The federal government has failed to secure the border. And so, under this clause where we're allowed to act in our self defense as a state, we should be able to send the Texas State National Guard to the border. So, as you say, Nick, this clause has never been interpreted by the court. We don't know. We don't have a binding definition by the judiciary of what is an invasion. I think this is a really hard question. I think this is a close question, actually. Because if Mexico sent thousands of troops across the border, no one would doubt that Texas could act immediately to repel the invasion. But what if the people who come across the border are unorganized? What if they aren't carrying weapons? What if they aren't acting pursuant to the orders of any country? They're just moving across the border for economic or political reasons. Is that an invasion?
And I think that's really the question. I mean, and I tried looking through all my documents, some letters that the founding fathers wrote. I went back through the Federalist Papers. And the reason that I started off with Article 4 was because there was only one Federalist paper I could find that dealt with this idea of invasion, and it was Federalist 43. And they didn't
Mhm.
really define it there either. I mean, they talked about obviously nation states that are acting in violence, but they also brought up the idea of ambitious and vindictive enterprises. Now, I don't know what that means. I don't know how to interpret that to you.
Mm-mm. So I this is the so it's clear to me, I think, that if it was nation states, that would definitely be enough. I think if it was just purely innocent people, moving for a better life, even though they're violating our laws, I don't think a state could use military force. But what if it's something in between? So the closest things I can think of, this is how we think about this. What are the other actors back in the 18th century when our founders wrote the Constitution who are in that gap? So one would be Indian tribes. So Indian tribes are not nation states. They're organized politically in a way. Um, we had a century and a half of our nation dealing with them as kind of a cross between nations, but also not. Then you have mercenary gangs, pirates. These were all, in a way, the 18th century was much more messy even than today. And I think, you remember, let's go back to history you and I both love, Nick. Jefferson waged war against the Barbary pirates. Right? We had, the reason the shores of Tripoli are in the Marine Corps hymn is because Jefferson sent the Marines to Tripoli to fight the pirates. Now, they weren't really pirates, but we had wars against pirates back then. So I think that's really the question. Are these people moving across the border? I think many, many, many are innocent, but there are no doubt organized crime gangs involved too. Is that enough to make them like pirates and mercenaries that a state could have defended itself against in the 18th century?
And let's make it even more complicated. So there are reports that, a lot of the people from Venezuela that are coming up were actually released from Venezuelan prisons. So we have that
Mm.
aspect. Then we have the China aspect, where we used to find about 200 border encounters with Chinese nationals. Now it's up to 20,000 a month. And so the nation states that are sending or allowing these people to leave their countries, are they doing it for nefarious intent? And does that complicate it even further? You have the
Mm.
cartels, you have actors like Venezuela and China engaged in this. So does that complicate it even further?
Oh, it definitely does. And then one last thing is, uh, I think part of this is caused by a decision by the Supreme Court that I think was wrong, which is called Arizona versus United States, which is from just about 10 years ago. And
I
this is a
remember I
case
still
where,
bring it up in my class.
oh yeah, it's a really important case, and only now people are paying attention to it because, uh, and this is a case where Arizona, I think, tried to do some of the things that Texas is trying to do now. Arizona tried to authorize its police to be able to hold people who are in the country illegally, check their status, turn them over to the federal government. And the Supreme Court, I think, incorrectly said that the states have no authority in immigration at all, so that they're forbidden from holding people who cross the border illegally. The best they could do is if they were already arresting them for some other crime under state law, they could hold them for that, and then they could tell the federal government they had found somebody. But you could see how, and more importantly, the Supreme Court said that the states are not allowed to interfere with the federal government's decision on how vigorously to enforce immigration laws. Uh, that led to this problem because now, if the Biden administration is not enforcing the immigration laws strictly at the border, this Arizona case says that states can't back them up or fill the gaps, which is what Governor Abbott's trying to do in Texas. So I think that the way out for Texas is to use this occasion to bring the Arizona case back to the Supreme Court, ask for it to be overruled, say, the court didn't anticipate you ever have an executive branch where we would just pursue an almost open borders policy. Everyone just thought this was just how a fight between the federal and state government, how far to go enforcing immigration law. But if federal government's defaulting on its responsibilities, doesn't a state have some right to also step in? If the Supreme Court came to its senses and overruled this Arizona case, I think that diffuses this border conflict between Texas and Biden.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. And you're someone that was in the Department of Justice. Now, what we hear from President Biden and the Biden administration is he says he doesn't have any authority, executive authority, to solve this problem. He says that he needs a Congress to pass a bill, get it to his desk in order to enforce border laws. Does he have executive authority to stem this flow that's been going on?
Yeah, of course he does, because you know what? I mean, it's just political posturing. I mean, that's just not true because you know what? Trump was president under the same exact laws. There's been no change in the laws between then and now. And Trump was able to enact a whole bunch of policies. You might remember, although this was not aimed at the southern border, but remember the very first big political controversy with President Trump, which was called the travel ban, where he, the Trump administration essentially cut off migration from, looked initially like Muslim countries. We were worried about terrorism. Then the group expanded. But the president has the right to close the border if he thinks there's a national security threat. And you know what? The Supreme Court upheld him. Trump won. It's a case called Trump versus Hawaii. So, and that case gives you a step-by-step map about how President Biden could really restrict travel across the US-Mexico border if he wanted to. It's not even a close question because there's a Supreme Court case just a few years ago that tells you that you can do it.
There isn't, and people need to be aware that when it comes to government and government regulations, government bureaucrats are wordsmiths, and they don't necessarily lock chief executives into any action. A lot of the words you'll see is may or shall, to make sure that they're not locked in. And isn't it true that when it comes to the asylum laws, that there are escape hatches where the president could deem that the border is being overwhelmed and reject asylum claims outright?
Well, like this provision I was just talking about now, based on national security grounds, you might remember during COVID, we also closed the Mexico border on public health grounds. As you say, Nick, there are these different escape hatches or exceptions which are there for unforeseen circumstances, for emergencies. And it seems to me that with all the problems at the border we're reading about, the President Biden would definitely have authority if he wanted to use it to restore some of the Trump era immigration policy. That it's not a legal problem. It's that Biden doesn't believe in it. I mean, I think that he's really been captured by this wing of his party. You're probably familiar with academics who say these things too, who think that immigration laws are immoral, that borders shouldn't exist, that we have as much an obligation to people who don't live here as we do to American citizens. It just flies in the face of basic principles of having a nation state in the first place. But I think Biden's been and his White House have been captured by this ideology, and that as long as I can understand why you would adopt these policies, which have not tried to stop illegal immigration, but actually have encouraged it. I mean, the Biden administration, the policies have just created incentive for more people to come
Yeah,
illegally.
that's certainly true. And you brought up something interesting. I wasn't even going to go down this road. It wasn't even a thought in my mind with you, but now I might as well bring it up since you broached the topic, talking about academics. I wrote
Hmm.
a piece several months ago for Campus Reform talking about how nearly every major college and institution has codified in their mission statements this idea of global citizenship. What are your thoughts on that, where they view citizenship as an accident by birth?
Yeah, I've had you just mentioned the academic forces. You wrote a piece. I've had debates. I always start with the American Constitution and our world order is built on the idea we have nation states, and the nation state is defined as controlling a population and territory and having borders. If you don't have those, you don't have nation states. Uh, the reason why I think people, academics, which is filtered into the Biden administration, hate this is because they worship ideology. So they like the idea, oh no, we're all not subject to borders and the countries. We should be moved by great ideas. I think this is one of the most dangerous approaches that has led to the deaths of millions of people in the last century, right? What was communism? What was fascism? But the idea, oh, dispense with your histories and your traditions and your constitutions. You must worship at the altar of our, radical theories, our ideas, which right, overcome, which replace our loyalty to our country and our communities and our family. And when you do that, you saw the results last century in Soviet Union and Mao's China. I think we're seeing it again. Unfortunately, it's coming full circle. It's coming from our own country now, from many of the elite leaders of our country, this idea that we should not feel loyalty to our country and our land and our people.
Yeah, it really is scary. And I think that's the difference with people like me and people like them is where if there's no loyalty to the country, there's a void that opens up. And it's the government apparatus that begins to fill that void, that the government becomes more important than the state and more important than anything, faith, the family, it doesn't matter. And that's what they're doing. They tend to think, like I always hear my students will say, well, the reason communism failed is because it wasn't implemented right. It wasn't implemented the way Marx intended. And I sit there and ask them, So you telling me that you'd be able to implement it right? That, there's obviously a reason that it cannot be implemented the right way because it's an idealistic approach that goes against the very nature of human beings, does it not?
This goes back to the difference between our revolution and the French Revolution. The communists, Marxism is just another variation of the French revolutionary idea that humanity is oppressed by history and tradition, and we should just wipe it out, and we can create a new kind of man that'll be really different that will not act according to the human nature that we have known for millennia. And I'm glad you raised the Federalist Papers because the Federalist Papers are very suspicious of this idea. Remember, the Federalist Papers actually have a pretty dour view of human nature. Remember, it says, if men were angels, you wouldn't need government. But
Yeah.
we need government, right? Because I think that the American Revolution, in that sense, is a kind of conservative revolution. And I think the French Revolution, which, the ideals of that become Marxism and the distortions of it. That this idea that, oh, we have found the key to utopia if we could just get rid of all institutions, if we could get rid of the nations, if we could get rid of the idea where different peoples and replace it with fealty to one idea, which, as you point out, Nick, never has worked in practice. In fact, when it's been tried in practice, has led to the deaths of 20 to 40 million people.
Yeah, and people are willing to surrender their sovereignty, to intergovernmental organization. They don't realize power is power. The vacuum of power will always exist, and people do have ambitions. People can be greedy, and I'm also skeptical of human beings like the founding fathers were. I know that majorities could be capable of some really bad things. That's why they chose a republic as opposed to a pure democracy.
Mm.
Now, I want to get your thought. I don't want to go into depth with it because we're going to be hearing the case next month, and I certainly want to have you back to talk about it. But the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the Trump immunity case.
Mm.
Now, I was very pleased to see the 9-0 decision booting Colorado, telling them,
Mhm.
no, you can't just take his name off the ballot. It was nice to see a unified court. Do you think that the court will be this unified when it comes to the immunity thing, no matter which way they decide? I can't predict
I
which way they're going to
I
decide.
I I think they're going to be unified, but I think in this case, Trump's going to get bad news. I don't think that the court's going to find that there's a absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for former presidents. But this is a legalism because immunity just means I can't ever be prosecuted. I just can't even be forced to show up in court. That's a very different question than whether the charges against him are constitutional. And I actually think he's going to lose on the immunity case, but then he's going to have some really significant challenges to the prosecution. Uh, because when you look at the prosecution, the special counsel, Jack Smith, has failed to charge Trump with insurrection. Instead, he's charged him with these sort of penny ante white collar crime laws, like defrauding the United States, even though there's no money or property at stake here, of interfering with a congressional investigation, although there was no such thing going on here, uh, and brushing aside his First Amendment rights. The claim that I gave a speech and I'm allowed to say what I want. I was running for office. I'm not responsible for what people did afterwards. It's a terrible thing, but this idea that it was a conspiracy to violate the criminal laws, I think that that's going to fall apart after the immunity issue, and then Trump can actually raise these constitutional claims. So
And
no, but I just think people are making too much of the immunity question because Trump's going to lose. I think he's going to lose, but it's actually just the first shot in a whole series of fighting about the constitutional issues here.
And I will say, when the justices were hearing the Colorado case, they were bringing up the question of insurrection a lot, including the liberal justices who seemed very uncomfortable with this wide-ranging definition of insurrection that is being put out there. John, I really appreciate you coming in. I have to go because I got to go to a little kid science fair. So we'll see how that works
It's
out.
far more important than this,
It certainly is.
especially if there are explosions.
Yeah, well, we're going to see what happens. So I really enjoyed the conversation, and I would love to have you back after the
Of
Supreme Court
course.
hears the immunity case.
Of course. My pleasure.